I destroyed my entire family over a Thanksgiving dinner, and I'd do it again in a heartbeat. That's probably not what you expected to hear, right? But let me back up for a second because this story, my story, isn't about being petty or vindictive. It's about finally standing up after spending 31 years being treated like I was invisible. My name is Morgan Fletcher, and for as long as I can remember, I've been the spare, the backup, the one who showed up to family events just so my parents could say they had two kids instead of one. My sister Scarlett was the sun, and I was just there, orbiting, forgotten. I'm a CPA. I work with numbers, spreadsheets, tax returns. The boring stuff that keeps businesses running but doesn't exactly make for exciting dinner conversation. Scarlett, she went to Harvard, married a plastic surgeon, lives in a mansion in Beacon Hill that looks like it belongs on a magazine cover. She's everything my parents ever wanted, wrapped up in perfect blonde hair and a trust fund smile. That Thanksgiving in Boston, I walked into my parents' house carrying a homemade pecan pie. I'd spent 3 hours on it that morning, getting the crust just right, making sure the filling was perfect. My mom took one look at it and barely nodded. She told me to just put it in the kitchen because Scarlett was bringing desserts from some fancy bakery downtown. I should have left right then, but I didn't. Because part of me, that stupid, hopeful part, still thought maybe this time would be different. Dinner started the way it always did. My dad asking Scarlett about her latest accomplishments, her new promotion, her summer house in Cape Cod, her wonderful husband Blake. Every single achievement was celebrated like she'd just won a Nobel Prize while I sat there, fork in hand, chewing turkey that tasted like cardboard. Then my mom turned to me with that look. You know the one? The look that says she's asking out of obligation, not interest. She asked if I was still working at that accounting firm, and the way she said still made my stomach turn. I told her I'd been promoted to senior manager 3 months ago. She said that was nice, then immediately turned back to Scarlett. But it was my dad's next words that shattered something inside me. He looked right at me and said, I needed to accept that I'd never be as good as my sister, that Scarlett was special. And me? I was reliable. Then he laughed. My mom laughed too, like it was the funniest joke they'd ever heard. Something snapped. Not broke, snapped. Like a bone that's been cracked for years finally giving way. 28 years of comparisons, of being second best, of having my accomplishments brushed aside like they meant nothing. It all came rushing up my throat, and for the first time in my life, I didn't swallow it down. This is a long story, and I need detail of what happened next. The lies I uncovered, the money that was stolen, and how the daughter they underestimated took everything from them. If you want to hear how a single moment of clarity turned into a war I actually won, make sure you're following along here. You won't want to miss what comes next. I stood up from that table, and my hands were shaking so hard I had to grip the back of my chair. But my voice was like it was coming from someone else. I told them to tell Scarlett she could take care of them when they got old, that she could organize the holidays, that she could answer the phone calls at 3 in the morning when they had emergencies. Because the daughter they'd spent a lifetime showing up, done trying to earn love they were never going. The silence in that dining thick, I could feel it pressing. My dad's fork was frozen halfway to his mouth. My mom's face had gone completely white. And Scarlett just stared at me with her mouth open like I'd just spoken a foreign language. I grabbed my coat from the hallway and walked out. My whole body was buzzing with adrenaline, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst right through my chest. I made it to my car before the tears started, hot and angry, streaming down my face. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. Scarlett had followed me into the driveway. She called my name, her voice shaky, and I turned around. I asked her if she knew, if she'd known this whole time that they treated me like garbage. She went pale. She stammered something about thinking it was just jokes that she didn't realize, but I cut her off. I told her she never defended me. Not once, because being the favorite was too convenient to risk. I drove back to my apartment in Cambridge with mascara running down my face and my hands still trembling on the steering wheel. The second I got inside, I did something I should have done years ago. I blocked all of them. My parents, Scarlett, every phone number, every social media account. Just gone. Then I called my best friend Jade. She's a therapist, one of those people who can read you like a book within 5 minutes. I told her I needed help processing 30 years of emotional abuse, and she didn't even hesitate. She told me to come over right then, that night, and we'd start figuring it out together. The next few weeks were brutal. Therapy sessions where I cried so hard where I had to confront the facts had systematically made me feel worthless my entire life. Jade helped me see patterns I'd been blind to, the way they'd dismiss every accomplishment, the way they'd compare me to Scarlett at every opportunity, the way they'd trained me to be grateful for scraps of attention. But here's the thing about being a CPA. I'm good with details. Really good. And when my mind is trying to distract itself from emotion, it tends to fixate on numbers and patterns. About 6 weeks after Thanksgiving, I was going through some old family documents I'd kept in a box under my bed. Tax returns, mostly. Copies of things my parents had asked me to review over the years. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I was just looking. That's when I found a letter from my grandmother's estate attorney. It was addressed to my parents, dated 15 years ago, right after my grandmother passed away. I'd never seen it before. It must have gotten mixed in with some papers they'd given me to file. The letter referenced a trust fund my grandmother had established, equal distributions to both grandchildren upon her death. My heart started beating faster as I read. Equal distributions. I'd never received anything from my grandmother's estate. Not a penny. My parents told me she'd left everything to Scarlett, the special. I'd believed them because, why wouldn't I? They were my parents. My hands were shaking again as I pulled out my laptop. I started digging through public records, estate filings, anything I could find. And there it was. My grandmother had left a trust fund worth $680,000, split equally between me and Scarlett, $140,000 each. I sat there staring at the screen, my stomach churned. Where was my money? I'd never seen it, never been told about it. Scarlett had bought her house 10 years ago with what she called a family gift. She'd paid for her wedding with savings, she'd taken vacations, bought cars, lived a life that seemed just slightly beyond what even her good job should have afforded, and suddenly everything made sense. The reason they'd kept me close but kept me small. The reason they'd never wanted me to succeed too much, to ask too many questions. The reason Scarlett's life looked so perfect while mine felt like a constant struggle. They'd been stealing from me for 15 years. I made an appointment with a forensic accountant the next morning. His name was Robert Chen, and he specialized in estate fraud. I brought him everything. The letter, the public records, copies of documents I'd managed to obtain. I told him I thought my parents had stolen my inheritance, and I watched his expression darken as he reviewed the paperwork. He told me to give him 2 weeks, that he'd need to pull financial records, track transactions, build a timeline. His voice was calm, professional, but I could hear the anger under. He said if what I suspected was true, this wasn't just family drama, it was federal fraud. Those 2 weeks felt like 2 years. I could barely sleep. I kept going to work, kept meeting with clients, kept pretending everything was normal while my entire world was tilting on its axis. My phone kept ringing with calls from numbers I'd blocked. Voicemails piled up. My mom crying, saying she didn't understand why I was doing this to the family. My dad, angry, demanding I stop being childish. Scarlett, her voice small and scared, begging me to just talk to her. I deleted every single one without listening all the way through. When Robert finally called me back to his office, the look on his face told me everything before he even opened his mouth. He slid a folder across his desk, and I opened it with trembling fingers. Bank statements, transfer records, dates and amounts, all highlighted in yellow. For 15 years, regular deposits had been made from the trust fund, but they'd all gone into accounts under Scarlett's name. The down payment on her house, her car, her wedding, even some of her business investments, $340,000, my money, just gone. Funneled to my sister while my parents smiled to my face and told me I'd never be as good as her. Robert told me I had a case, a strong one. He said we could sue for full restitution, and depending on what else he found, there might even be criminal charges. His eyes were hard when he said my parents had forged my signature on waiver documents, making it look like I'd voluntarily given up my claim to the inheritance. That's when I realized the cruelty wasn't just neglect. It was calculated, deliberate. They'd planned this. I sat in that office, staring at the evidence of my family's betrayal, and I felt something I'd never felt before. Not anger, not sadness, something colder, clearer, stronger. I looked up at Robert and told him I wanted to go after every penny, every single one, and I wanted them to know exactly why this was happening. He smiled, a sharp, satisfied smile, and told me he'd start drawing up the paperwork that after. Then he said something I'll never. He said sometimes the people who underestimate you are the ones who give you the greatest because they never see you. I walked out of his office into the gray Boston after, and for the first time in my entire life, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed. The war had just begun, and they had no idea what was about to hit them. Robert moved fast. Within 3 days, he had subpoenaed 15 years of financial records from the trust, my parents' bank accounts, and every transaction linked to Scarlett's name. What came back made my blood run cold. It wasn't just the inheritance money. That was bad enough. $340,000 siphoned away while they told me I was worthless. But the record showed something worse, something that made me physically sick when I saw it. My parents had been taking out credit cards in my name since I was 22 years old. Small amounts at first, carefully managed so I'd never notice. They'd intercept the statements, pay the minimums, keep everything just below the radar. But over 9 years, they'd racked up nearly $60,000 in debt that I didn't even know existed. That's why my credit score had always been lower than it should have been. Why I'd been denied for a car loan 3 years ago and couldn't understand why. They'd been using my identity, my social security number, my clean record, and destroying it piece by piece to fund their lifestyle and Scarlett's. I sat in Robert's office staring at the spreadsheet he'd created, and my hands were shaking so badly I had to put down my coffee. He told me this elevated everything. That identity theft combined with estate fraud meant we were looking at serious federal charges if I wanted to push it that far. I asked him what would happen if I did. He leaned back in his chair and laid it out for criminal prosecution, jail time for my parents. Scarlett would have to prove she didn't know about the fraud, and the paper trail suggested she absolutely did know. At minimum, she'd be liable for repayment of everything she'd received. The house in Cape Cod she was so proud of, the one she posted about constantly on social media, calling it her little piece of heaven, bought almost entirely with my stolen money, the fancy wedding where she'd had ice sculptures and a live orchestra. I'd paid for the photographer, the flowers, and half the venue without even knowing it. Robert pulled up another document. Emails between my parents and Scarlett from 8 years ago. My mom had written to her explaining that they were reallocating Morgan's because Scarlett needed it more, and that I would never know because I was too trusting to question. Too trusting. They'd weaponized the fact that I loved them, that I kept showing up year after. I felt something crack open inside my chest reading those words. Not my heart. That had already broken. This was something else. This was the death of every good memory I'd ever tried to hold on to. Every birthday, every Christmas, every moment I'd convinced myself they cared about me even a little bit. It was all a lie. I was never their daughter. I was their mark. Robert asked if I wanted to take a break, but I shook my head. I needed to see all of it, every ugly detail. So he kept going. There were more emails, Scarlett asking if they were sure I wouldn't find out, my dad reassuring her that I was too busy with my little accounting job to pay attention, my mom joking that I was so desperate for their approval, I'd believe anything they told me. They'd laughed about it, made jokes about how easy it was to manipulate me, and Scarlett, perfect, golden Scarlett, had gone right along with it. She'd known from the beginning. The room felt too hot, too small. I could hear my pulse in my ears, feel my throat getting tight. Robert slid a box of tissues across the desk, but I didn't cry. I was past crying. I looked up at him and told him I wanted to file everything. Civil suits for full restitution with interest, criminal complaints for identity theft and fraud. I wanted every legal avenue explored, every charge that could stick pursued. He nodded slowly and told me this would destroy my family, that once we filed, there was no going back. The relationships would be over permanently. I met his eyes and told him the relationships were already over. They'd been over the moment my parents decided I was worth less than my sister, the moment they forged my signature and stole my future. He started typing, and I sat there listening to the click of the keyboard, feeling something cold and sharp settling into my bones. They'd made me the villain in their story for 30 years. Now, it was time to show them what a real villain looked like. The lawsuit was filed on a Wednesday morning in February. Robert handled everything. The paperwork, the filing, the official notifications. But I wanted to be the one to tell them it was coming. I unblocked my mother's number and called her that after. My hands were steady this time. No shaking, no tears. Just cold, calculated. She answered on the second ring. her voice jumping up an octave with she started talking immediately, saying she was so glad I'd finally come to my senses, that family was supposed to forgive each other, that Thanksgiving had just been a misunderstanding. I let her talk, let her dig herself deeper into the fantasy that I was calling to reconcile. Then I told her to expect legal documents within the next 48 hours, that I was suing her, Dad, and Scarlett for fraud, identity theft, and embezzlement of my inheritance. The silence on the other end was beautiful, pure, shocked silence. Then she started screaming, asking how I could do this to my own family, calling me ungrateful, saying I was destroying everything over money. I told her she was right about one thing: I was destroying everything. But it wasn't over money, it was over 30 years of lies. And then I hung up before she could say another word. My dad called 6 times in the next hour. I didn't answer. Scarlett texted me a dozen messages, each one more desperate than the last, swearing she didn't know anything, begging me not to do this. I left them all on read, but Robert had advised me to do something strategic, to maintain so we could monitor what they were saying, catch them in lies, maybe get them to incriminate themselves further. So 3 days after the lawsuit was filed, when Scarlett called from a number I didn't recognize, I answered. Her voice was thick with tears. She asked if we could meet for coffee, just the two of us, to talk this through like sisters. She kept saying she never meant to, that she didn't understand how things had gotten so bad between us. I agreed to meet her, but because I wanted to see her face when she tried to lie to mine. We met at a Starbucks in Cambridge, neutral. She showed up looking rough. No makeup, hair in a messy ponytail, dark circles under her eyes. For a second, I almost felt bad. Almost. Then I remembered the emails where she joked about me being too trusting. She sat down across from me and immediately started talking, saying she'd been going through the documents her lawyer sent over, that she was shocked by what she was seeing, that she had no idea Mom and Dad had been using my identity for credit cards. Her eyes were wide, wet with tears. And if I hadn't seen the emails myself, I might have believed her. I let her talk, nodded in the right places, played the part of the sister who might be convinced. Then she said something that made my entire body go still. She told me that if I dropped the lawsuit, she'd help me get my money back, that she'd talk to Mom and Dad, make them see reason, work out a payment plan. She reached across the table and grabbed my hand, squeezing it tight, and told me we could fix this as a family. I looked down at her hand on mine, the hand wearing a diamond bracelet that probably cost more than my rent, and something clicked. She wasn't here to apologize, she was here to protect herself, to negotiate, to make sure she didn't lose everything she'd built on my stolen money. I pulled my hand back slowly and asked her why she thought I'd want to fix this as a family, why I'd trust any of them after what they'd done. Her face changed for a second. The tears stopped, and something harder flashed. She told me I was being dramatic, that families help each other out all the time, that it was normal for parents to allocate resources where they were needed most. She said I'd always been sensitive, always taken things too personal, and there it was. The real Scarlett. The one who'd been perfectly fine watching me struggle while she lived off my money. The one who'd known exactly what was happening and didn't care as long as she benefited. I smiled a real smile, and I told her she was absolutely right. I had always been too sensitive, trusting, too willing to accept whatever scraps they threw my way. But that version of me was gone. She blinked, confused, and started to say something else, but I stood up. I told her my lawyer would be in touch, and that she should probably start looking into selling that Cape Cod house because she was going to need the money. The look on her face, shock mixed with rage mixed with fear, was worth every second of pain I'd felt over the past 3 months. I walked out of that Starbucks and got into my car, and my phone buzzed immediately. A text from Scarlett. Not apologetic, not kind, just 3 words. "You'll regret this." I screenshotted it and sent it straight to Robert with a message. She just threatened me, add it to the file. He responded within minutes. One sentence that made me smile wider than I had in years. She just made this so much easier. They're panicking. And panic, I was learning, made people sloppy, made them show their true colors, made them say things they shouldn't say and make mistakes they couldn't take back. I drove home through the Boston, and for the first time since this whole nightmare started, I felt something close to happiness. Not because I was hurting them, though I won't lie and say that didn't feel good, because I was finally my own story. They'd spent 30 years writing me as the superior in Scarlett's perfect life. Now I was rewriting. They were terrified of how it was going to turn. They should be. Discovery is a beautiful thing. That's the legal term for when both sides have to hand over evidence before trial. Robert filed motions for everything: emails, text messages, financial records, documents going back 20 years. And my parents' lawyer, some overpriced guy from a firm in downtown Boston, had to comply. What came back in those boxes of documents changed everything I thought I knew about my family. Robert called me into his office on a gray March afternoon. He had that look on his face, the one lawyers get when they found something big. He told me to sit down, that what he was about to show me was going to be hard to process. He slid a stack of papers across the desk. Medical records from 32 years ago, my mother's OB/GYN visits from when she was pregnant with me. I didn't understand why he was showing me this until I read the highlighted sections. My mother had complications during her pregnancy with me. Severe ones. Preeclampsia that developed into HELLP syndrome. She'd almost died. The doctors had told her she couldn't have any more children after me, that another pregnancy would likely kill her. I sat there staring at the pages, my hands going numb. I'd never known any of this. Never been told that my birth had nearly cost my mother her life, but that wasn't the worst part. Robert pulled out another document. A letter my mother had written to her therapist 6 months after I was. It had been subpoenaed from the therapist's archived files. Apparently, she'd kept detailed notes on my mother's postpartum depression. In the letter, my mother talked about about looking at me and seeing all the things she'd lost. Her health, her ability to have more children, life. She wrote that when she looked at Scarlett, she saw joy. But when she saw pen limit. She'd blamed me for not being able to give my father a son, for ending their dream of for stealing her perfect future. I was 32 years old, and I was just now learning that my mother had hated me from the moment I was born. Not because of anything I'd done, not because I wasn't good enough, but because I'd had the almost. Robert's voice was gentle. He showed me emails between years ago, right around the time my grandmother died and the trust fund was distributed. My father had written to my mother suggesting they split the money equally like the will stated, that it wasn't fair to take everything from me. My mother's response made my stomach. She'd written that I owed them, that the money they'd spend on raising me, on medical bills from her complication, everything. I owed them that. She said Scarlett deserved the money because Scarlett had brought them joy. I'd brought them nothing but problems. My father had argued for exactly one more email. Then he'd given in. Just like that. My own father had decided I wasn't worth fighting for. I sat in Robert's office, and I couldn't feel my face. Couldn't feel anything. It was like my body had just shut down to protect itself from the sheer weight of what I was learning. Robert told me this actually strengthened our case significantly. It established motive and showed premeditation. It proved that the theft wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was deliberate punishment for the crime of being born. But he also told me I should take a few days before deciding how to proceed, that this kind of information could break a person, and he needed me to be strong for what was coming next. I went home and didn't leave my apartment for 3 days. I called in sick to work, didn't answer calls from Jade or anyone else. I just sat on my couch with my cats and tried to process the fact that my entire existence had been unwanted from the very beginning. Every memory I had suddenly had a new context. Every cold shoulder, every dismissive comment, every comparison to Scarlett, it all made sense now. I wasn't the disappointing daughter. I was the daughter they'd never wanted in the first place. On the third day, something shifted. I was looking through old photos, torturing myself with pictures of family vacations and birthdays, when I found one from my college graduation. I was standing alone in my cap and gown, smiling at the camera. My parents hadn't come to the ceremony. They'd said they were busy. Scarlett had been on vacation in Europe. I'd graduated summa cum laude from Boston University with a degree in accounting. I'd done it completely on my own, with student loans and part-time jobs and zero support from anyone, and I'd still managed to finish in the top 5% of my class. That's when I realized something. My mother was wrong. I didn't owe them anything. They'd fed me and clothed me because that's what the law required. But everything I'd become, every success I'd achieved, every good thing about me, I'd built that myself, despite them, in spite of them. They'd tried to break me for 32 years, and I was still standing, still successful, still strong. The only thing they'd succeeded in doing was making me resilient enough to destroy them. I called Robert that evening and told him I wanted to add the medical records and the therapist's letter to our evidence file. I wanted the judge to see exactly why they'd stolen from me. I wanted everyone to know that my parents hadn't just committed fraud. They'd committed a lifetime of emotional cruelty against a child who'd done nothing wrong except survive. Robert warned me that making this public would be painful, that people would know my mother had never wanted me, that it would be humiliating. I told him I was past humiliation, the only shamed were the ones who'd looked at a baby and decided she deserved punishment for being born. He said he'd file the amended complaint in the morning. Then he told me something that made me smile for the first time in days. He said my parents' lawyer had reached out asking about settlement negotiations, that they were scared of going to trial with this evidence. I told Robert there would be no settlement, no negotiation. I wanted my day in court. I wanted them to have to sit there and listen while their crimes were read aloud. I wanted Scarlett to have to explain to a judge why she'd accepted hundreds of thousands of dollars that she knew were stolen from her sister. Most of all, I wanted them to know that the daughter they'd tried to erase had become the one thing they never expected, someone who couldn't be intimidated, bought, or silenced. The trial date was set for June, 3 months away. Robert told me to prepare myself, that it was going to be brutal. I told him I'd been preparing for this my entire life. I just hadn't known it yet. April came with rain and the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. I was in my office at the accounting firm, working on a client's tax return, when my assistant told me someone was there to see me. No appointment, no name given, just a woman who said it was urgent and personal. I almost told her to send whoever it was away. I wasn't in the mood for surprises, but something made me say yes. The woman who walked into my office was probably in her mid-50s, well-dressed in a business suit with sharp eyes and graying hair pulled back in a tight bun. She introduced herself as Patricia Whitmore, and the name didn't mean anything to me until she said she was my grandmother's estate attorney. My heart started pounding. I gestured for her to sit down, and she closed the door behind her before taking the chair across from my desk. She told me she'd been following my lawsuit, that she'd seen the filing and recognized the case number from my grandmother's estate. She said she needed to tell me something she should have told me 15 years ago, and that she'd been carrying the guilt of it ever since. I just stared at her, waiting. Patricia explained that when my grandmother died, she'd left explicit instructions in her will. The trust fund was to be split equally between both granddaughters. And there was a letter, a sealed letter, that was supposed to be given to me personally on my 25th birthday. My grandmother had been very specific about that detail, but my parents had convinced Patricia to give them the letter instead. They'd told her I was going through a difficult time, that I was fragile, that they wanted to make sure I received it in a supportive environment. Patricia had trusted them. She'd handed over the letter, and she'd never followed up to confirm I'd actually received it. My voice came out flat when I asked what was in the letter. Patricia reached into her briefcase and pulled out a copy. She'd kept one in the file, thank God. She slid it across the desk, and I opened it with shaking hands. My grandmother's handwriting filled the page. She wrote that she knew how my parents treated me, that she'd watched for years as they favored Scarlett and diminished me. She wrote that she saw me, really saw me, and that she was so proud of the strong, intelligent woman I was becoming despite. The trust fund was her way of making sure I'd be okay. She wanted me to have security, independence, and the ability to build a life control. She wrote that I deserved so much more than they'd ever, and that she hoped this money would help me see. The letter ended with one line that broke me. "You were never the problem, Morgan. You were always enough." I sat there with tears streaming down my face, and Patricia's voice was thick when she apologized. She said she'd been a coward, that she'd trusted my parents when every instinct told her not to, that she'd failed my grandmother and failed me. But then she told me why she'd really come. She'd kept copies of everything. Every document, every email, every communication regarding the trust. She had proof that my parents had explicitly acknowledged both distributions in writing. She had the original sealed letter they'd promised to give me. She had emails from my mother asking how to handle my portion of the estate. Patricia told me she was willing to testify, to bring all of her records to court, and lay out exactly how my parents had manipulated the entire process. She said it would probably cost her professional reputation. People didn't like lawyers who turned on their clients, even former ones, but she didn't care anymore. She was tired of staying silent while they got away with what they'd done. I asked her why she was doing this now. Why not years ago? Why not when it could have actually prevented all of this? She looked me straight in the eye and told me the truth. She said she'd been afraid, that my parents had powerful friends, connections in the legal community in Boston, that she'd convinced herself it wasn't her place to interfere in family matters. But when she'd seen my lawsuit, when she'd read about what they'd done with the credit cards and the identity theft, she'd realized her silence had enabled monsters. I called Robert immediately and put him on speaker. When Patricia explained who she was and what she had, I watched his entire He started asking rapid-fire questions about documentation, about timelines, about what exactly she'd witnessed. By the time she left my office 2 hours later, Robert had copies of everything. The emails, the letters, the proof that my parents had lied to the estate attorney, had deliberately concealed my inheritance, and had violated the explicit wishes of a dying woman. But the sealed letter? I kept the original of that. I took it home and put it in a frame on my wall. Grandmother's words, the only family member who'd ever actually loved me, looking down at me every day, reminding me that I wasn't broken, that someone had seen me and valued me exactly as I was. That night, Jade came over with wine and takeout. I showed her the letter, and she cried with me. She told me this changed everything, not just legally, but emotionally, that I'd spent my whole life thinking I was unlovable, and now I had proof that I'd been loved, that someone had tried to protect. Robert called the next morning. My parents' lawyer had contacted him again about settlement. Apparently word had gotten out that Patricia was cooperating with us, and they were panicking. They were offering full restitution plus $50,000 if I'd agree to keep everything confidential and drop any criminal complaints. I laughed. Actually laughed. They thought they could buy my silence for $50,000 after stealing over $400,000 and destroying my entire childhood. I told Robert to counter with this: full restitution with 20% interest, a public apology read in open court, and they had to fund a scholarship in my grandmother's name at Boston University for students who'd overcome family adversity. $100,000 into the scholarship fund, non-negotiable. And no confidentiality agreement. I wanted the right to tell anyone and everyone exactly what they'd done. Robert warned me they'd never accept those terms, that they'd rather go to trial than face that kind of public humiliation. I told him that was fine, because Patricia's testimony was going to humiliate them anyway. At least this way, something good would come out of the damage they'd caused. He said he'd send the counteroffer over. Then he told me something that made my entire week. He said I was the bravest client he'd ever worked with, that most people would have taken the settlement, taken the money, and tried to move on. But I was demanding accountability. I was demanding justice. I told him it wasn't bravery, it was just being tired of letting terrible people get away with terrible things because it was easier than fighting. 2 days later, my parents rejected the counteroffer. Their lawyer sent back a nasty message saying I was being vindictive and unreasonable, that I was trying to destroy my family over money I didn't even need. I read the message and smiled, because they still didn't get it. This had never been about the money. It was about the 32 years they'd stolen, the childhood I'd never get back, the love I'd begged for and never received. The trial was now 6 weeks away. Patricia had given us everything we needed to win, and I was going to make sure that when this was over, everyone knew exactly who my parents really were. The daughter they'd tried to erase was about to become impossible to ignore. May arrived, and with it came the pre-trial motions and depositions. Robert was in full warrior mode, and I was right there beside him for every single one. My mother's deposition was first. I wasn't required to be there, but I insisted. I wanted to see her face when she had to answer questions under oath. She walked into the conference room at Robert's office looking thin and exhausted. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Her lawyer sat beside her, a stern-faced woman named Barbara Chen who'd clearly told her to say as little as possible. Robert was surgical. He walked her through every transaction, every forged signature, every lie. And I watched her squirm, watched her claim she didn't remember, didn't know, didn't realize. It was almost funny how someone who'd been so sharp and calculating for 32 years suddenly couldn't recall basic facts. But then Robert brought out my grandmother's letter, the original sealed one that was supposed to come to me. He asked my mother if she'd ever given it to me. The silence stretched out so long that her lawyer had to prompt her to answer. My mother finally admitted she hadn't. When Robert asked why, she said she'd been planning to, that she'd just been waiting for the right time. Robert asked if 15 years seemed like a reasonable amount of time to wait, if perhaps there was never going to be a right time because she'd never intended to give it to me at all. Her lawyer objected, but the damage was done. My mother's face had gone red, and I could see the rage building behind her eyes. She wanted to yell at me, wanted to tell me I was ruining everything, but she couldn't. Not here, not on the record. My father's deposition was worse. He'd always been the quieter one, the one who went along with whatever my mother wanted. But under Robert's questioning, a different picture emerged. He'd been the one who suggested using my social security number for the credit cards. He'd been the one who'd researched how long they could get away with it before I'd notice. My mother had wanted to just take the trust fund money, but my father had seen an opportunity for more. Robert asked him directly why he'd done it, why he'd stolen from his own daughter. My father looked right at me for the first time that day, and his voice was cold. He said I'd been an expensive child. The medical bills from my mother's complications, the therapy my mother needed afterward, the years of resentment and difficulty. In his mind, I owed them. The trust fund wasn't theft, it was repayment. I felt something inside me turn to ice. He genuinely believed I should be grateful they'd only stolen my inheritance and not more. That I should thank them for not abandoning me entirely after I'd had the audacity to almost kill my mother by being born. Robert asked if he understood that a child couldn't be held financially responsible for their own birth, that what he was describing was literally illegal. My father just shrugged, said the law and morality weren't always the same thing. That deposition ended with my father's lawyer practically dragging him out of the room. Robert looked at me and told me we'd just won the case, that a jury would hear that testimony and crucify them. But it was Scarlett's deposition that gave me what I really needed. She showed up 3 days later looking worse than I'd ever seen. Her perfect blonde hair was dull and flat. She'd lost weight. There were dark circles under her eyes that even makeup couldn't hide. Word was that Blake had officially filed for divorce. Her perfect life was... Robert started gently, establishing timeline and facts. Then he pulled out the emails, the ones where she'd joked about me being too trusting, the ones where she'd asked if I'd ever find out. Scarlett tried to claim she'd been uncomfortable with what our parents were doing, that she'd wanted to tell me but didn't know how. Robert asked why she'd accepted the money if she'd known it was stolen, why she'd bought houses and cars and lived off funds that weren't hers. She didn't have a good answer. She stammered something about trusting our parents' judgment, about assuming they knew what was best. Then Robert asked the question that changed everything. He asked if she'd ever told Blake where the money for their lifestyle came from. Scarlett went pale. Her lawyer immediately told her not to answer, but it was too late. The look on her face told me everything. Blake didn't know. He'd thought all those family gifts and trust fund distributions were legitimate. When the lawsuit was filed and he'd found out the truth, that his wife had been living off stolen money, that's when the marriage had imploded. Robert pressed harder. He asked if Blake had said anything specific when he found out, what his reaction had been. Scarlett's lawyer objected repeatedly, but Scarlett was already talking. She said Blake had called her a fraud and that he'd said he couldn't be married to someone with that kind of moral corruption, that he was worried about how it would affect his medical practice reputation if it came out that his wife's family were criminals. She started crying, mascara running down her face. I felt nothing, no sympathy, no satisfaction, just cold, empty nothing. This woman had stolen my childhood, my inheritance, my sense of self-worth, and now she was crying because her perfect life had consequences. The deposition ended shortly after. Scarlett left without looking at me, her lawyer's arm around her shoulders. Robert and I sat in the conference room afterward, and he told me we had everything we... The depositions alone were damning enough, but combined with Patricia's testimony and the paper trail, this was going to be a massacre in court. But then he told me something I wasn't expecting. He said my parents' lawyer had contacted him that morning, before Scarlett's deposition. They wanted to talk settlement again, and this time they were willing to meet almost all of my demands. Full restitution with interest, the scholarship fund, the public apology. The only thing they wanted was a partial confidentiality clause. They'd admit wrongdoing in court, but they didn't want me giving interviews or writing about it publicly afterward. Robert said it was a good offer, that going to trial was risky, even with our evidence, that I should seriously consider taking it. I sat there looking at the stack of deposition transcripts on the table. My mother's lies, my father's cold justifications, Scarlett's tears that came 15 years too late. I asked Robert what he thought I should do. He leaned back in his chair and told me, he said as my lawyer, he thought I should take the settlement. It was everything I'd asked for except the absolute freedom to tell my story publicly. But as a person who'd gotten to know me over the past few months, he said he thought I needed the trial, that I needed to hear a judge validate what had been done to me, that I needed the public record, told him I'd think about it, that I needed a few days. That night, I sat in my apartment with my grandmother's letter in my hands, reading it over and over. You were never the problem, Morgan. You were always enough. I thought about what she would want, what she would tell me to do, and I realized I already knew the answer. My grandmother had left me that money so I could be free. Taking a settlement with a confidentiality clause meant staying silent, meant letting them control the narrative one more time. I called Robert at 8 in the morning and told him to reject the settlement offer. We were going to trial. He asked if I was sure. Told me one last time that it was going to be brutal, that they'd try to attack my character, paint me as vindictive and greedy. I told him I'd been called worse things by better people my entire life. Let them try. The trial was set to begin in 2 weeks, and I was ready to watch my family's lies burn in the light of day. The courthouse in downtown Boston was cold on that June morning. I wore a navy blue suit, professional, serious, unshakable. Robert met me on the steps and told me one more time what to expect, that my parents' lawyer would try to make me look vindictive, that they'd try to paint this as a family disagreement blown out of proportion. I told him I understood, and I meant it. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. My parents sat on the other side with their lawyer, Barbara Chen. They looked older than I remembered, smaller. My mother kept dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, playing the victim before the trial even started. Scarlett wasn't there. Her lawyer had worked out some kind of deal where she'd testify but wouldn't have to sit through the whole trial. Probably couldn't face me for that long. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Justice Andrea Morrison. She had a reputation for being fair but tough, and the look she gave both sides when she entered made it clear she wasn't going to tolerate any drama. Robert's opening statement was clean and devastating. He laid out the facts chronologically: the trust fund that was supposed to be split equally, the forged signatures, the credit cards taken out in my name, the emails showing premeditation and conspiracy, the medical records proving my mother's resentment, my grandmother's letter that was deliberately withheld. He told the jury this wasn't a family dispute. It was systematic theft and fraud committed against a daughter who'd spent 32 years trying to earn love that was never going to be given. Barbara Chen's opening statement tried to paint my parents as imperfect but well-meaning people who'd made mistakes. She talked about the financial stress of raising 2 children, the medical bills from my mother's complications. She tried to suggest that the trust fund reallocation was a reasonable parental decision about resource management. But I could see the jury's faces. They weren't buying it. The first witness Robert called was Patricia Whitmore. She walked through the estate documentation with the precision of someone who'd been doing this for 40 years. She explained my grandmother's explicit instructions. She testified about how my parents had convinced her to hand over the sealed letter. She admitted her own failure to follow up and verify I'd received it. Then she read my grandmother's letter aloud in court. Her voice cracked when she got to the last line. "You were never the problem, Morgan. You were always enough." I saw 2 jurors wipe their eyes. My mother stared at the floor. Barbara Chen tried to cross-examine Patricia, suggesting she was testifying to assuage her own guilt. Patricia didn't flinch. She said yes, she felt guilty, and she should. But that didn't change the facts of what my parents had done. The forensic accountant Robert had hired took the stand next. He walked the jury through every transaction, every forged signature, every stolen dollar. He showed them how the money from my trust had been systematically funneled to Scarlett over 15 years, how the credit cards in my name had been opened and managed from my parents' home address. The numbers were damn $340,000 from the trust fund, $62,000 in credit card debt, interest and penalties that brought the total to $428,000. Barbara Chen tried to argue that some of the credit card charges were for things that benefited me: family vacations I'd attended, gifts at Christmas. The accountant calmly explained that using someone's identity without permission was illegal regardless of how the money was spent, that you couldn't commit fraud and then claim it was a gift. Then came the moment I'd been both dreading and waiting for. Robert called me to the stand. I walked up there with my heart pounding, but my hands steady. Robert started with the easy questions: my name, my age, my education, career, establishing that I was a successful, independent adult who didn't need to fabricate this story. Then he asked me to describe my childhood, to tell the jury what it was like being the second daughter in the Fletcher. I told them everything: the constant comparisons to Scarlett, the way my accomplishments were dismissed, the jokes at my expense, the feeling of being invisible in my own. I told them about graduating summa cum laude and having no one show up, about working 3 jobs to pay for school while Scarlett's education was fully funded. Robert asked if I'd known about the trust fund. I said no, that I'd been told my grandmother left everything to Scarlett because she was the favorite. He asked how I'd felt when I discovered the truth. I looked right at the jury and told them I'd felt like my entire life had been a lie, that the people who were supposed to had been robbing me blind while making me feel worthless for being poor. Barbara Chen's cross-examination was brutal. She asked if I was angry at my parents. I said yes. She asked if this lawsuit was about revenge. I said no. It was about justice. She tried to suggest I was exaggerating the emotional abuse, that lots of siblings get compared to each other, that I was being oversensitive. I looked at her and asked if lots of siblings get told they owe their parents for being born, if lots of siblings get their identities stolen and their inheritances embezzled, if lots of siblings have to find out through legal documents that their mother resented them from day one. She didn't have a response to that. The deposition videos were played next. The jury watched my father calmly explain that I owed them, watched my mother claim she couldn't remember details about documents she'd signed, watched Scarlett admit she'd known the money was questionable, but took it anyway. By the time the prosecution rested, I could see it in the jury's faces. We'd won. Parents didn't even put on much of a defense. Barbara Chen called a few character witnesses. Neighbors who said they were good people, a pastor who talked about their church involvement, but none of it addressed the actual evidence. My father took the stand. He tried to explain his reasoning, but under Robert's cross-examination, he just kept digging deeper. He actually said that given the circumstances of my birth, they'd been generous to give me anything at all. The courtroom went silent. Even his own lawyer looked horrified. Robert didn't need to say anything else. He just thanked my father for his honesty and sat down. Closing arguments were quick. Robert reminded the jury this was about facts, not feelings. The evidence was clear. The fraud was undeniable. The question wasn't whether my parents were guilty, it was whether the jury would hold them accountable. Barbara Chen tried to appeal to sympathy, to suggest that families were complicated and that tearing mine apart over money was tragic. But the jury was out less than 3 hours. That's fast for a civil case. When they came back, the forewoman read the verdict. Liable on all counts. Full restitution plus 20% interest. $428,000 plus $85,000 in interest and penalties. Total of $513,000. The judge added her own ruling. She ordered my parents to fund the scholarship at Boston University, $100,000. She ordered them to issue a written public apology to be filed with the court and published in the Boston Globe. And then she did something I wasn't expecting. She referred the case to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. She said the evidence of fraud and identity theft was clear enough that the state should consider charges. My mother started sobbing. My father just sat there, stone-faced. Their lawyer tried to argue, but Justice Morrison shut it down. She said she'd seen a lot of cases in her career, but the systematic cruelty combined with the financial crimes was among the worst she'd encountered. Robert and I walked out of that courthouse into the June sunshine, and I couldn't breathe. Not from sadness or fear, from relief, from the sheer weight of 32 years of gaslighting being lifted off my shoulders. A judge had looked at all the evidence and said I was right. A jury had agreed. It was real. It had happened. And I wasn't crazy for being hurt by it. Robert told me they had 30 days to appeal, but he doubted they would. The verdict was airtight. I'd probably see my money within 90 days. But the money wasn't what made me smile as I stood on those courthouse steps. It was the thought of that public apology going into the newspaper, of everyone they'd ever lied to knowing of the scholarship that would carry my grandmother's name and help students who'd survived what I survived. The daughter they'd tried to erase had just erased them instead. And it felt like finally breathing after being underwater my entire life. The money hit my account on a Tuesday in September, 3 months after the verdict. $513,000. I stared at the number on my phone screen for a long time, and the strangest thing happened. I didn't feel the rush of victory I'd expected. I just felt tired. Robert called that afternoon to tell me the scholarship had been funded. The Margaret Fletcher Memorial Scholarship for students who'd overcome family adversity would start accepting applications in the spring. Boston University had already promoted it on their website. My grandmother's name, her legacy of actually loving me, would live on and help other people who'd been hurt by the families that were supposed to protect them. That part made me cry. Good tears for once. The public apology ran in the Boston Globe the following Sunday. It was brief, legally worded, utterly devoid of actual emotion. But it was there, in print, permanent. Everyone they knew, every neighbor, every church member, every country club friend would see it. Would know what they'd done. My mother's book club dropped her within a week. My father resigned from the board of his golf club before they could ask him. The social death they'd always feared more than anything else had arrived. Scarlett lost the Cape Cod house. It sold at auction to cover her portion of the restitution. Her divorce from Blake was finalized in October, and from what I heard through mutual acquaintances, he'd made sure she didn't get much. Turns out prenups are pretty airtight when you can prove your spouse built her lifestyle on stolen money. She tried to reach out to me one last time, about 6 months after the trial. A long email about how she was sorry, how she'd been thinking about everything, how she hoped we could eventually rebuild some kind of relationship. I read it once, then I deleted it. Not out of anger. I was past anger by then, but because I realized I didn't want her in my life anymore. She wasn't my sister. She was just someone who'd benefited from my pain and only felt bad when it finally cost her something. The district attorney did end up pressing criminal charges against my parents: fraud, identity theft, forgery. They took a plea deal: 2 years probation, community service, and a permanent mark on their records. My father lost his financial advisor license. My mother had to take anger management and therapy as part of her probation terms. I didn't go to that hearing. I'd already gotten what I needed from the civil trial. The criminal stuff was just confirmation of what I already knew. They were criminals who'd gotten away with it for far too long. But here's what I didn't expect. The healing part was harder than the fighting part. For 32 years, I'd organized my entire life around trying to earn their love. Every decision, every achievement, every part of my identity was shaped by the hole they'd left in. And now that the fight was over, I had to figure out who I actually was without that weight. Therapy with Jade became twice a week for a while. We worked through layers of trauma I didn't even know I'd been carrying. The way I apologized for taking up space, the way I downplayed my own accomplishments, the way I'd learned to make myself small and quiet and undemanding, because that was the only way to survive in my family. Slowly, carefully, I started building something new. I used part of the money to start my own accounting firm, Fletcher Financial Justice, specializing in forensic accounting and fraud investigation, helping other people untangle the financial messes that family members had created. Turned out there were a lot of us out there. People who'd been stolen from, lied to, manipulated by the people who were supposed to love them most. My first client was a woman whose brother had drained their mother's retirement account while she was in a nursing home with dementia. Within 3 months, I'd tracked every penny and helped her get it back. The look on her face when I showed her the recovered funds, that was better than any verdict. The business grew fast. Apparently, a CPA who'd successfully sued her own family for fraud was exactly the kind of person other fraud victims wanted on their side. Within a year, I had to hire 2 associates. Within 18 months, I moved into a real office in Cambridge with windows that looked out over the Charles River. I bought a condo in the South End with exposed brick and high ceilings and space for the life I was building. Adopted 2 cats from a shelter, Athena and Justice, because I'm apparently that predictable. Started dating for the first time in years, though that part was still messy and complicated and scary. But I met someone. Marcus. He teaches economics at Northeastern, has kind eyes and a dry sense of humor, and when I told him my story, the whole ugly truth of it, he didn't run. He just held my hand and told me he was glad I'd survived them, that the world was better with me in it. I'm still learning how to believe that. Some days are easier than others. The first holiday season after the trial was strange. No obligatory Thanksgiving dinner, no Christmas morning pretending everything was fine. Just me and Jade and a few other friends who'd become my chosen family. We cooked together, laughed too loud, drank too much wine, and nobody compared me to anyone else. It was the best holiday I'd ever had. Parents tried one last time to reach out, about a year after everything ended. A letter, not an email, an actual handwritten letter, arrived at my office. My mother's handwriting. She wrote that she was sorry things had gotten so out of hand, that she hoped eventually I could forgive them. That family was supposed to stick together. I read it standing by my office window, looking out at the city I'd built my new life in, and I realized something that would have broken me a few years ago, but now just made me sad. She still didn't get it. She was sorry things had gotten out of hand, not sorry for what they'd actually done. Sorry they'd been caught and faced consequences, not sorry for 32 years of systematic cruelty. I didn't respond. I just filed the letter away in a folder marked Evidence Ongoing Psychological Patterns and moved on with my day. Because here's what I learned through all of this. Closure doesn't always come from other people. Sometimes you have to create it yourself. Sometimes the people who hurt you never really understand what they did or why it was wrong. You can spend your whole life waiting for them to finally see you, finally value you, finally love you the way you deserved all along. Or you can save yourself and build a life so good that their absence becomes a gift instead of a wound. I chose the second option, and it was hard and messy and painful, but it was also the best decision I ever made. 2 years after the trial, my firm is valued at over $2 million. I've helped recover more than $8 million for clients who were defrauded by family members. The scholarship in my grandmother's name has already sent 3 students to Boston University, all of them survivors of who deserved a chance at something better. I still think about them sometimes. Parents, Scarlett. Wonder if they ever really understood what they lost when they decided I wasn't worth loving. Wonder if my mother ever read my grandmother's letter and realized that at least one person in our family had seen me clearly. But mostly, I don't think about them at all anymore. I think about the client meeting I have tomorrow, the date with Marcus this weekend, the vacation Jade and I are planning to Italy in the spring, the life I've built from the ashes of the daughter they said would never be as good as her sister built an empire. The daughter they called just reliable became unstoppable. The daughter they tried to erase became impossible, and the best part, I did it all without them. Without their approval, their money, their love. Turned out I never needed those things in the first place. I just needed to stop waiting for them to give me permission to value myself. So, if you're out there listening to this, if you're the forgotten child, the scapegoat, the one who's never quite good enough no matter how hard you try, I want you to know something. You're not the problem. You never were. The people who can't see your worth are the ones with broken vision, not you. And when you finally stop trying to fit into their story and start writing your own, that's when everything changes. That's when you realize you were always enough. You just needed to believe it yourself. I still have my grandmother's letter framed on my office wall. You were never the problem, Morgan. You were always enough. Some days I need to read it more than others. But I'm learning, slowly, instead of hers. Living, I was always just had to survive long enough to see it. And now I'm not just surviving, thriving, building, creating, helping other people find their way out of the darkness I clawed my... The daughter they underestimated became the woman they could never... And that's the best revenge of all. Not destroying them, but building something so that their absence becomes irrelevant. I hope wherever you're watching this from, you'll leave a comment and let me know what city you're tuning in from. It means everything to know I'm not alone in this, and that maybe my story helped you feel less alone too. And if you want to follow along for more stories of survival and justice, hit that subscribe button, because there are so many more stories to tell. And I'm not done fighting for the people who deserve better. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And remember, you were always enough too.